Hi guys, welcome to my first live stream on building reusable custom hooks with React. So React hooks were basically introduced about a year and a half. So they are pretty common now. Almost everyone loves to use React hooks, and people are building like really interesting stuff with it. If you go to React documentation, they have a nice introduction section here for how to using React hooks. So here they have a nice React Conf video that says how to write 90% cleaner React with hooks. So basically what React hooks does is, previously we had class components, and the class components did a really poor job in abstracting complex piece of code. So if we had like event listeners, or if we had like some complex asynchronous API calls. So in such scenarios, these state components made the code not much reusable. So we had to follow patterns like higher order components, render props, but still there are a lot of potential with the functional components, because we write a lot of functional components and they were easily reusable. So hooks basically takes the state from the stateful components and lets functional components manage their own states. And by letting functional components manage their own state, they also introduced a new way of writing reusable programming logic. So in today's stream, we'll be covering some of the common use cases that people usually asked me before. So the use cases that I am planning to cover here include how to do event handlers, how to do API calls, custom did update hook, and also a use previous hook to get the previous value from state. So we will be doing this four things in today's live stream, and I am also planning to keep it really short and simple for everyone to understand. So let's start. Starting with that, first thing, mostly what we do with real world application is we add a lot of event handlers. So one of the common event handlers I can think of is basically on hover. So say I have to do some feedback when mouse hovers over some element. So what I'll do is I'll create a state hover and set hover use state false. So what's going to happen is, whenever I hover over the text element, it's going to create a new state. It will say that the text is being hovered upon. So to do that, I'm writing on mouse enter. I'll also create a function called a toggle hover. So it basically takes the value from previous state and sets the opposite value. So on mouse enter, I'm calling toggle hover. On mouse leave, I'm calling toggle hover. This should be enough. So whenever I move my mouse over this text input, it's going to call the hover element, and based on that event, it's going to update some state. So I'll create a style component, style property here. I'll say color. If it's hovered, it's going to be red, otherwise it's going to be black. So now if I hover above this React element, you can see the color actually changes to red, but if I take my mouse away from it, it changes to black. So this is a common scenario we do in our everyday project, but how do we make it completely reusable? Say whenever I move my mouse into any DOM element, it's going to do some kind of callback. So in that scenario, let's start with building a simple hook. So inside my src directory, I'll create a new directory. I'll say hooks. So I'll write all my hooks inside this directory. So the first hook I am going to do is useHover. So what this useHover hook is going to do is, it's going to take my existing input element, the element I'm going to pass, and it will apply the specific callback needed for that element. So I'll create the useHover hook here. So hooks are basically just functions. These functions basically export some states and effect hooks from the actual React component. So let me export useHover. Cool. Then here currently the actions are bound to the DOM elements in JSX. That quite makes it impossible to abstract this logic away. So instead of relying on attributes, I am actually going to use ref. So what I'll do is I'll create a target element property here. I will use ref. So this target element is going to be the DOM element on which the hover action is going to happen. Then yeah, I'll take the states. Then I'll also remove these items, these attributes. So the toggle hover is no longer needed. Then here I'll add a use effect hook. So this use effect hook basically gets called on component mount and component update. So now I have the use effect hook. In that, what I'll do is target element dot current. So I'm going to assign this ref to a target DOM element. So from the DOM element, I'll get the current value of that, and I'll add on mouse enter. So this is a normal DOM attribute on mouse enter, which gets fired every time mouse basically enters the that corresponding element. So here I'll say set hover to true, and target element dot current dot on mouse leave. Here I'll set the hover value to false. And a good thing about a good programming practice is always cleaning up these event listeners when the component unmounts. So technically these are not event listeners, we are just passing event handlers, but still I'll just add a null here. Done. And yeah, this state is missing. Done. So I got the target element. Now this hook basically returns two items. So it's going to return the hover state, and it's also going to return the target element, so that we can pass this target element to a corresponding DOM's ref attribute. So back in my app component, I technically no longer need this. So what I'll do is, instead of use state, I'm going to say use hover, and I'll call it target element. Use state is no longer needed in our component, so we got the target element. Here's the fun part. So right now this hover component is going to be completely reusable. So say I'm going to use a value for the info text. So I'll say info hover, and it's going to be info target element. So in my info text, which is the h2 tag, I'll add a ref. I'll say info target element. Now going back, let me refresh the page once. Okay, it says some problem. Okay. It says it will automatically have cleaned up this line, so it's not needed. The return value is not needed here. Yeah. So when I hover over this element, you can see it's basically doing the red highlight. Now this use hover is a reusable hook, because now say if I want to make the title element respond to hover of my mouse, then what I'll do is I'll add another variable here. Instead of hover, I'll call it title hover, and title target element. Then in my title I'll just have to pass a ref. Then again in the style part, if it's active I'll set the value to green, otherwise it's going to be black. So in a few lines of code I basically got the elements responding to hover events. So you can see the title hovers to green, and when I am hovering over the info text it's turning to red. So this is how powerful React hooks are. Basically we took this entire block of code and we completely abstracted away the internal working and made it reusable to use in any React component from here onwards. And the reason why I removed that cleanup hook is because whenever the element unmounts, it automatically gets its event handler cleaned. So there is no need to clean it up separately. So that's why I had to remove that. Cool. This is the first item, event handlers. Now let's see how to do API calls, or better, I'd actually say how to do a custom DidUpdate hook. So right now we have useEffect hook. So this useEffect hook basically runs on component didMount and component didUpdate. So these were the two lifecycle methods that previously existed in state components, and useEffect basically does both of the lifecycle method in a single hook. So here I'll say mount or update. It's going to be called in both of the items. So let me refresh the page. It says mount or effect. So basically this is where the mount event happens, and when I am hovering over the element, an update event happens. So when it turns red, it will print it once. It turns black, it will again print another output. So now in class components we had component didUpdate, a separate lifecycle method that only does didUpdate. But here we have a useEffect that does both. So what if I only want to do didMount or didUpdate? So when you want to do didMount alone, what the easiest trick is passing in an empty dependency array. So according to React hooks, the useEffect will not undergo any change if there is no dependency element to track. So now if I hover over any of these elements, you can see there is no console log statements being printed because this acts as component didMount. But what if I want to simulate a didUpdate lifecycle? So here's where things get interesting. So what we can do is there is again an hook that we are going to use, useRef. The speciality of useRef is that let me tell you, has mounted. So this variable is going to track if the component has mounted or not. So I'll have a useRef here. I'll set it to false. So the specialty of useRef is, unlike useState, whenever we change the value of that ref variable, the component will not re-render. It will not trigger any kind of lifecycle events. So we are free to change this value. And since this value will not get reassigned like any other normal variable, so if I assign a normal value like const a equal to hello, and I change the value a here, a equal to in my useEffect, a equal to world. So what happens is in the next render, the value of a will be reassigned to hello. So that makes normal variables useless, but ref will not get reassigned. Ref will maintain its value as false until it's explicitly asked to change. So in the useEffect hook, to simulate didUpdate, what I'm going to do is I'll check if the component has mounted or not. So has mounted dot current. So the value of false will be present inside a property called current in the has mounted ref. So has mounted dot current. If it's true, then I can execute some code. Say I can say console.log didUpdate. Only if it's true. Otherwise, has mounted.current equal to true. Change it to true. Basically, this useEffect gets executed on first mount. So when it's mounting first, we will update the value to true, and this will not execute on the first mount. So let me do a refresh and see how it works. So here, let me hover. Okay, you can see it's doing did update, but when I do a refresh, the did update is not printed. So basically this specific piece of code basically does custom did update hook functionality. Now let's extract it into its own hook. So going back to my hooks directory, I'll create a new file, useDidUpdate.js. So this useDidUpdate is going to be our custom hook for the did update lifecycle. Then I'll bring this code back into the did update deal and add the missing import statements. And useDidUpdate is going to accept one attribute, which is going to be a callback function, CB, short for callback. Then the callback will be executed on the second mount. So that's it. We don't have to return any value here. So going back, what we can do is we'll write useDidUpdate, and we can write a callback inside it, just like useEffect. And I can write any code here. I'll say did update lifecycle. Let me do a page refresh here. Now if I hover into the element, you can see the did update lifecycle is getting printed. But if I refresh the component on did mount, the console statement hasn't been printed. So this is how we can do a really nice did update hook. Then let's look at the API calls hook. How to do API calls with a React hook. Before going that, let me also show you where this kind of hook is being used. So in React navigation, there is a use focus effect. So this is a custom hook in React navigation. So this basically works by that principle. So here it listens to the current navigation stack's focus and ensures that the callback function, this corresponding callback, will be executed only when the navigation stack is in focus. And there are a lot of other custom libraries which also do their own use lifecycle hooks based on this similar logic. And one other neat trick when working with this kind of lifecycle hooks is this method that I have here. So this method basically gets created every time the app component re-renders. So this function basically doesn't have any external dependencies. You can see it accepts no argument. It just prints a console.log statement. So it is pretty inefficient to recreate this every time the component re-renders. So to make it much more optimized, there is a hook called useCallback. So with this useCallback hook, we can prevent unnecessary creation of this lifecycle method, and it currently has no dependencies. So the dependency array is an empty array. Okay, yeah. Basically, when I write this function inside useCallback for consecutive re-renders, this function will not be recreated. Cool, that's the update hook. Now let's see how to do a custom fetch hook. Let me get some mock API for some data. So JSON placeholder has some mock APIs. Yes, so this is one of the JSON placeholder API. I need to go to their homepage, JSON placeholder. Okay, I'm back at the JSON placeholder homepage. So these guys have some fake APIs that I can quickly fetch from. So this is one of their API. Let me get that. So I'll create a function here. I'll call it load data. So inside load data, I'm basically doing a fetch operation that gets data from this specific URL. So then I'll add a button below that. On click, I'll call the load data function. So I have a button here. So when I click on this button, it's going to fetch data from the remote server. Let me try that. Okay, it basically fetched the data, and this is the resulting data. So while doing this, we also, it's a general practice, we maintain some states for the data, loading indicators and stuff, and the error object. So let me create all those states. So this is going to be the data. Let me create. So data set data is loading, set is loading, error, set error. So these are all states that track the status of the corresponding API call. Let's see how well we can make it reusable. So whenever the API call starts, I'm set the isLoading attribute to true. Then the response is available here, not here actually. This is where the response gets parsed into a JSON. The response is actually available here in the second chain. So here I need to set data to the JSON value and set isLoading to false and set error to null. Basically no error happened at this point. Remove the console.log statement and then have a catch statement that basically does the opposite. It says it's error to the error object and it will set the data to null and is finally available here. No, I cannot do finally. Babel isn't configured to support finally in this sandbox. So what I can do is I'll set isLoading to true again, false here also. So this is a normal fetch API call, and these are all the states. Let me also print those states. Console.log data is loading and error. So these are the three states associated with this corresponding fetch request. So by default, all the values are null. Is loading, I'll actually set the value to false. Cool. So by default, values are null and false. Let me load data. Now you can see the values are being updated. First, this loading state actually turns to true. After a while, we'll get the actual data and the error value is still being null. To make it easier to read, I'll convert this to an entire object. I'm clicking on load data. Yes, the loading basically turns to true first and then the data is loaded and the loading gets back to false. Cool. It is working as expected. Next thing is, how do we make it a reusable hook? So we have the loading indicators and we also have the fetch logic. So what I'll do is I'll go back to my hooks directory and start creating my custom hook for fetch. Use fetch.js. Then in this custom hook, we can basically move all the logic we wrote in the previous app component into this custom hook directly. So I'll just get all this code and I'll move it inside the fetch component. And here in the load data, I'll have a separate argument for getting the URL. so that this can load data from any URL. So if you are handling fetch request for get, post or different methods, you can basically add a second argument that has the config, and you can pass the config to fetch directly. But here let's keep it simple. A simple get request is enough. Then I'll construct an object here that contains the fetch status. So this fetch status is nothing but the console.log object that we had. I'll take that object and I'll bring it inside the useFetch module. So I got the fetch status. Then I'll return the fetch status and the load data method. So what happens now is whenever you call the load data method with that specific URL, this corresponding status will be updated in fetch status. So this makes this hook really powerful and it can handle any kind of API calls. So going back to my app.js, let me currently it says load data is undefined. So I'll use the useFetch hook that I just created. So in this useFetch hook, my arguments are going to be task API status and load task. So basically it's going to load some task. Then here I'll say load task. Actually load task accepts a URL, so I'm gonna call it with the URL, that URL being the value that I got from JSON placeholder. Done. And I can actually print the task API status. So this should give me the object of the data. So right now the data is null. Let me do a refresh. So data is null, loading status is false. Now let me load some data. Now you can see the loading status turned to true and I have the response object from the API. And if something goes wrong, some error happens while this API is running, we'll immediately have the value updated in the error object. So we can easily use this useFetch hook to fetch data from multiple URLs in the same component, and you can see the app component basically looks clean. So far it hasn't seen any kind of complexity because all the complex stuff happening are abstracted behind these hooks. So currently the component has an hover element. So anytime I hover, it turns the colors to green and red, and it also has the did-update lifecycle, and it also loads data from remote server. But on a whole, this component code basically looks clean and nice for anyone to work with. And the hooks that we created so far are also really nice. They have a really good API, so they can be used by any other developers who is coming in to work with us. And the last thing from today's stream is the use previous hook. So remember that we used to have component will receive props hook. Sorry, it's a lifecycle method. Component will receive props. So what it does is it takes the previous props before the component got updated, and it will compare it with the next props that the component is basically receiving. So component will receive props is actually deprecated now, but it was really useful in doing some kind of side effects, like checking if the user has logged in or not, checking if any task has been completed or not. So to do that, we basically need to track the previous state of a React state. So use previous is going to mimic that functionality. So to do that, let's write the basic logic. Again, we will be using the useRef. It is such a powerful hook. Trust me, you will be using it a lot once you get used to that hook syntax. So here I'll say const previous value equals useRef. So this is going to have the previous state value. Okay, it says the import statement is missing. Then I'll write a simple use effect. So which value should we look at? So we have task API status. So I'll get the data from the task API status. Okay, by default, its value is going to be data, and inside use effect, it's going to update the previous value with the newer data. Great, now let's see the console. Console.log of previous value dot do a refresh. So by default, the values are being printed as null. Yeah, here you can see that it has undergone some change. Here the previous value of the data is maintained as null, and when the new data got fetched, the new data is displayed with the new object. And again, when the object changes, it basically took the previous object. But since component basically re-renders a lot, it also got the successive value. So this example is not that clear, so maybe I can maybe I can put a counter or something. But yeah, this example basically does its job. So by starting, both the values are null, the previous value and the current value, and then on the next re-render, when the data got its value, the previous value is still maintained as null. And on the successive re-renders, every time it re-renders, the previous value tracks the data value one step back. So this way we can do the component will receive props check, and we can also move it into its own hook. So I'll create a new hook here, a new file. I'll say use previous value, and you can see all the hooks that I create start with the name use, because this basically is lets other developers know that you are currently importing a hook into their project. That's why it's a convention that's followed while creating hooks. So use previous value is there, then add that, and the value will be received as an argument. I'll return previous value dot current so that I don't have to write it every time. So you might be wondering how it works. We are basically taking the value from previous value, and then we are also changing the value on use effect. Now, to explain this, LogRocket has a really nice blog post. LogRocket use previous. Yeah. So which actually explains how the execution basically works when getting the previous value. So here, so this is the place where we are setting the previous value to a hook, So what happens is, while React is executing, this is the first line of code that executes, and then the previous hook executes. And inside our logic, the use effect basically gets useRef, it gets executed first, and then the return happens, which means this line of code and this line of code executes, and after returning the value only the use effect lifecycle method gets called, because that's when the component actually finishes mounting. So we are still able to track the previous value. So I'll say const previous data equal to use previous of data, and I'll add the import statement. So that's the use previous value hook. Now let me do a console.log statement here. Data, previous data. So now by default they both have values null. Now when I click on load data, you can see the previous the previous data should be before the current data. Okay, now let me do a simple refresh. Now when I click on load data, what happens is, by default they start with null values. On the first update, the previous value is still maintained as null. However, the current value gets updated to the data fetched from the remote server, and after that subsequent state updates happen, so the value basically syncs back. But every time a new value changes on data, the previous data will always carry the value from the past render, not from the current render. So using that, we can easily implement component will receive props check in this component. So that basically concludes the streaming session planned for today. So in today's session we learned about building reusable hooks. So we started off with useHover, which basically a event handler that lets you track events across multiple DOM elements, mouse hover events. And then we did useDidUpdate, which is a hook that mimics component didUpdate lifecycle method. Then we built a fetch method using a useFetch hook that gets data from the server and also tracks all the loading data and error states internally. Then we finally created usePreviousValue hook that gets the value from the previous render and lets you compare the value between the previous rendered state and the current rendered state. Now I'm actually planning on doing a lot of live streams from next week. So if you have any questions or any suggestions that you want me to do, if I can improve my streaming quality, or if there is any specific topic that you want me to do streams on, do send me a tweet at Twitter. I'm really active on Twitter. You can connect with me through Twitter, and I'll also be posting this video on YouTube. So if you think your friends or colleagues might be finding this video useful for them, do share the YouTube link with them. Thanks guys, thanks for tuning in. See you on the next live stream. Bye.